Okay, should I?
Yeah,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
can.
We'll start slowly. I don't have a lot to say before because we always seem to run out of time to for the Q&A, so it's probably better we don't do too much of this introduction. But I just want to thank Dr. Brent Adkins for being here today. I know I personally and in this group we always talk about how much we like Brent's scholarship. It's really good. I've always loved the Thousand Plateaus book, and um, so yeah. So I'll just do a quick introduction. So. Dr. Brent Atkins is a professor of philosophy at Roanoke College, Salem, Virginia, USA. It says here his primary interests are in 19th and 20th century European philosophy, modern philosophy, and politics. He has published numerous books, including A Guide to Ethics and Moral Philosophy, Deleuze and Guattari's A Thousand Plateaus, a critical introduction and guide, Rethinking Philosophy and Theology with Deleuze, a new cartography, Death and Desire in Hegel, Heidegger, and Deleuze, and Truth and Freedom, Spinoza's Practical Philosophy. The papers we are going to discuss today, which will be two of them. The first one is to have done with well, we don't have to discuss them in a certain order, but the first paper chronologically is on Deleuze specifically to have done with the Transcendental. And in this paper, Dr. Atkins argues that the notion of the transcendental, at least in the post-Kantian sense, is problematic for Deleuze's commitment to immanence, or as he writes, the transcendental becomes a dative which makes immanence imminent to something. At the end of the paper, he meditates on the possibility of Deleuze's notion of intensity, perhaps playing the role of the transcendental in his earlier philosophy. It is on this point in which we transition to the other paper on Michel Serres, which dovetails quite nicely, which the conclusion of that paper also contends, with this Deleuzian notion. So, as he writes, the Serres paper, which draws on a number of books, but specifically the Five Senses, in brief, Serres argues that the transcendental is nothing other than local circumstances that sometimes coalesce into contingent stabilities. So that was what I prepared to say. I actually, this might be the wrong way to do this. I'd actually like to start by talking about Serres, if you don't mind, Dr. Atkins. Just because I think the Deleuze paper kind of hints at this idea of intensity, being able to do everything the Transcendental was trying to do in Kantian philosophy specifically, and then Serres kind of gives us this vision of it. I'm not as familiar with Serres, and I was really intrigued by what Serres says. Um, so yeah, I guess if you could start us off with maybe a nice explanation for maybe some of those who haven't read the paper who are here today, um, on how Serres sort of does this.
The thing he does. Um, yeah, so I'm a late comer to Sayre, and so yeah, I'm not really sure how to find my way here. I don't have any mentors in Sayre. I'm just sort of flailing my way through. But I did notice that in the Five Senses in particular, he was not only concerned with the problem of the transcendental, but with recasting the problem of the transcendental. And maybe I could just talk briefly. I'm not entirely sure how to characterize the issue I see with the transcendental. I don't know if it's just some personal foible that I have with relation to the transcendental. Like I just viscerally don't like the idea of a transcendental, and wonder if it would be possible to do philosophy without it. I don't know if it's merely a linguistic problem that, oh, well, if we just called it something else, it would be okay. Or what I hope is the case, that it calls for a new kind of philosophy, which is what I do see happening in Deleuze and Serre. But in terms of Serre's view of the transcendental, um, Serre uh, briefly goes through the history of the transcendental, first in the medieval period, drawing on a problem from Aristotle about transgeneric categories or claims like the one or unity or the good or something like this. And this notion of the most general becomes determinative for the transcendental. So the true, the good, the beautiful, right? Classic transcendentals. And then Kant adds to this notion of the most common or the most general. He adds to it the notion of the conditional. And Serres' contribution is that he eliminates the general, the communissima of the medievals, and simply takes up the conditions as the transcendental. And so for Serres, the conditions are simply that which surrounds any given stability. So very famously, well, I don't know how famous anything is in Serres, but the image that he keeps returning to for the transcendental is the either death or translation of Romulus. So Romulus is reviewing the troops surrounded by senators, right? These are the circumstance, and a storm descends. When the storm lifts, Romulus is gone. And Livy says, well, some say that he was simply translated into heaven. He became divine at that point. Others say that he was murdered by the senators and they dismembered him and took parts of his body under their cloaks and whisked him away. And that's why Romulus disappears. But for Serres, he imagines the transcendental as not the general conditions for any event, but the singular, specific circumstances surrounding anything that is coherent or discrete, we'll say, calls it a torus, for example. Now, what that means is, and why I think this is a, we'll call it a minority position in philosophy, why I think it's a minority position in philosophy that's worth exploring is that transcendental in this case becomes relative to the event, and transcendental becomes singular. And you can, the position between the event and the conditions for the event can change places. So another example he gives in The Parasite is the case in which you're talking, around a table at dinner and the phone rings. Well, the phone is noise that intrudes on the conversation. But if you pick up the phone, if you take the call, then the conversation that you were having at the table becomes the noise that intrudes on this new conversation. And so in that case, circumstance and event switch places. And so we get a very, I think, and Serres would also say this, we get a very subtle account of the transcendental, not something, at least in the Kantian sense, that is a priori in relation to what it is the conditions for. But maybe I'll stop there for a moment and see if others want to jump in here on Serres or ask for clarification, or Brian, if you think there are other things that I need to talk about from the Serres paper.
No, that was terrific. I think I'll just give some instructions. So use the raise hand feature, and Ahmet and I will, maybe probably just one of us should organize. And
Okay.
we'll get to questions one at a time. Okay, I'll do it then. So yeah, so if anyone wants to use the little raise, you can raise your actual hand, I suppose, or the little emoji hand.
Well, I can start off.
Yeah, go for it.
So thanks, Brent. This is fantastic. I really enjoyed reading these papers. Never really thought of this that way. So two questions. You already raised one, like to what degree do you think it's a kind of linguistic issue? Because Deleuze says you create new concepts. So does he just have a new concept of transcendental? And if not, maybe there's a reason not to use that term, and Deleuze does seem to drop it. So I wonder, if you have any, thoughts about that he kind of thinks maybe it isn't the best concept to retain for what he's trying to do. But I looked this up when because I vaguely remember this. This is in an interview in Negotiations on a Thousand Plateaus, where Deleuze says, "Yeah, there are various ways of looking at concepts. For ages, people have used them to determine what something is, its essence. We are interested in the circumstances in which things happen, in what situations, where and when does a particular thing happen, how does it happen, and so on." And it occurred to me, maybe they were just reading Michel Serres at the time.
Maybe, maybe.
When because this is after A Thousand Plateaus is published, so that's published 81, and I don't know, when does Five Senses come out?
Not till 85.
85.
But they could have read The Parasite, where the same issue arises.
Yeah, so he doesn't use that word much, circumstances, and yet there it is. And then I searched it a little bit more, and then, well, they do use it more than I thought. So sort of a second question of influence. Do you think, because I didn't really notice this till I read your papers, do you think there was that sort of not just convergence between Serres and Deleuze, Guattari, but an actual influence?
Yeah, a great question, and I think I would love to sort of follow up the use of circumstance in Deleuze to see if I can sort of fill out the other side of this comparison I'm drawing. And on the question of influence, I don't know. It's clear that there was a fair amount of interaction between Serres and Deleuze, and they both admired one another. And, in A Thousand Plateaus, we get references to the Lucretius book, Birth of Physics, from Serres. In Anti-Oedipus, there's a reference to an early work of Serres on highway interchanges that comes up at this odd moment. So it does seem very clear that Deleuze was reading Serres, but I don't have enough information to connect the dots on whether they're using circumstance in the way that Serres is using it. And on your first question, I think, yes, it is a new concept of the transcendental. And then the question that remains in my mind is, well, if it's new, then would it be better to give it a new name, since the name transcendental already has all of this other baggage along with it? And I think that would be nice. But I definitely see the advantage of keeping the word transcendental to show that you're intervening in this very long history. And if you dropped it, that wouldn't be as clear. So I guess I've in the earlier paper on Deleuze, I was sort of all for just dropping the term transcendental, but Serres has made me rethink that, and maybe there's some value in retaining it for the purposes of showing how it differs from a traditional conception. But yeah, that it remains an open question for me.
Yeah, thanks. It reminds me there was a debate a while ago whether Deleuze drops ontology, which you probably know, because he says you shouldn't, it's play on words in French, a and est, which is to be, and then et, which is the connective and. So rather than talk about being, you talk about and it's connective. So people say, well, he didn't, he dropped ontology. And I had the same question then: is it worth saying that he has done with ontology, or does he just come up with a new concept of what ontology is, based not on essences, for instance, but on connectives and relations? So it is a kind of open question. So it's interesting. Maybe you're coming around suggesting maybe you can keep the transcendental as a concept, just to make us aware of this history that he's injecting himself into.
I guess I would be more wary of keeping it in Deleuze's case, precisely because of how important it is in difference and repetition. And here I recognize I'm in a real sort of minority position in relation to other Deleuze scholars who want to harmonize Deleuze's corpus. And I think there's a real shift that occurs with A Thousand Plateaus, and maybe before that in Anti-Oedipus, where he's intentionally abandoning this language of the transcendental. And so yeah, and on my reading of Immanence of Life, I think it's sort of the final having done with the term transcendental. So in Deleuze's case in particular, I wonder if it wouldn't be more in keeping with the trajectory of his thought to do away with it, whereas maybe not so much in Serres, for whom it's not such a central concept. But again, Serres scholarship is not nearly as developed as Deleuze scholarship, so who knows where this might go.
Yeah, just one last thing. Some of us are in a reading group and reading Difference and Repetition. There's a place there where he says, well, you couldn't understand this without doing a transcendental inquiry. It's a line he throws out there, more or less implying that's what I'm doing in this book. And so I raised the question, like, what exactly does it mean to do that? From Deleuzean point of view, because obviously not Kant anymore, but he still throws that thing up there like it's not just empirical. You have to somehow, get under the empirical. And so that's clearly how he, sees the methodology of difference and repetition. But I totally agree. Like Deleuze changes and he just lets things go. And, the becoming of his concepts then becomes a very hard thing to chart out, as you all know.
Right.
Thanks.
Amen.
Actually, Dan has already asked my question. Like I was going to ask why to call it transcendental if that transcendental, like in the case of Serres, means only the singular circumstances that give rise to or condition an event. So you have already answered that question beautifully. So I will try to kind of maybe rephrase my question and connect it to your Deleuze paper. So what I was thinking, maybe a difference between Serres, this is a question, not like a comment. So maybe I was thinking a difference between Deleuze and Serres on the transcendental might be the concept of virtual that Deleuze relies heavily on. So because like, while I was thinking why to call it transcendental if the transcendental conditions means only the singular circumstances. So in Deleuze, we might have a reason to call it transcendental because like this distinction between actual and virtual kind of gives us the transcendental field, because transcendental, as far as I understand, is the virtual as it generates the actual, not generates, but like gives us the genetic conditions of the actual. But in the Deleuze paper, you argue that like the intensive differences can do the same function. So I was going to ask, like, what is the relation between the intensive differences and the virtual in Deleuze, and where is the transcendental falls in this distinction, intensive or the virtual, or just in general, what's the what is the relation between intensive and the virtual? Yeah, and maybe we can connect it to Serres. Sorry if it was too mixed up, but yeah, I tried to connect it to your Deleuze paper. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll give it a shot, and if it's not what you're looking for, try again. So yes, this in fact is something that I struggle with. My temptation is to simply equate in some way the virtual and the intensive. But it's not that straightforward. In Difference and Repetition, the virtual isn't mapped on to the intensive. And it does seem to play this much more Kantian a priori role compared to the intensive in, say, 1,000 plateaus. And that ultimately is my worry. That's what concerns me about it, that it feels too Kantian. You know, despite all the caveats about the transcendental field and taking on Sartre's critique of Husserl and all these things, I wonder about that. And maybe it was just cowardly of me to say, well, let's just not talk about it and let's talk about it in these terms. But here would be my question, and it's a question I don't know the answer to. In difference and repetition, is it thinkable that the virtual and actual could switch places? That is, the virtual could be the virtual of some actual, and then the actual could become the virtual of another actual. So could we explain the model of the phone call from Serres in virtual and actual terms? My sense is no, that sounds wrong in relation to difference and repetition, but I'm happy to be corrected on this, right? In one way, if I'm wrong about this, it would solve all my problems, right? I wouldn't have to have this lingering suspicion about the transcendental in Deleuze that I don't have in Serres. And yeah, I mean, if those of you reading Difference and Repetition have something to say here, I would really love to hear your thoughts on that. But that would be my initial sort of take, and also avoidance of the question of the relation between the virtual and intensive in Deleuze.
Like
James?
we can come
Oh,
back.
sorry.
Yeah.
No,
Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay. So I think when Serres speaks of the circumstances of a singular event, that seems like he's speaking of actuals that are affecting actuals, which is Deleuze's term for history. So history is like the causation of actual things affecting other actual things. Like let's say if I ate something 3 hours ago and now it's giving me a stomachache now, but that's the circumstances of the actual thing now. My stomachache. Well, it was an actual action of eating something that wasn't good. And for Deleuze, when he always wants to find the transcendental conditions, those are always the virtual conditions of an actual, and not the actual historical conditions of an actual. And so that's when he makes between chronos and aeon. And so you want to find the virtual conditions that evoke a static genesis of the event here and now, which would be the syntheses of time, instead of a chronological understanding of circumstances of a previous event having a causal relation in its further present time. So I don't see at all really how Serres' transcendental and Deleuze's are really that close, because I really think Serres is just thinking of the historical conditions of a given thing. That's what he's calling the circumstances, and Deleuze is really looking for something different. And by different, I mean he's really wanting to go back to Kant and really try to find these non-historical a priori sort of factors that are determining how experience, real experience, is generated. And I also think I think you're really on to the idea that the virtual and the intensive are very different in difference and repetition. That, for the virtual, it's these ideal multiplicities, such as like white light. You say even there's like the multiplicity of music that has all the various, potential combinations of notes you could produce. And we were discussing this in our reading group last night, that intensity is what actually selects which of those virtual differential relations actually becomes actual. And so I think it's really hard, if you focus on difference and repetition, to reduce the virtual to the intensive, because they clearly have different roles and interrelate to each other very distinctly in difference and repetition. But I do believe in lots of other texts of Deleuze, he almost simplifies the transcendental into a single sort of regiment, which is like continuous multiplicities or virtual multiplicities. And he will often, I think, interchange intensive multiplicity with virtual multiplicity. So I think if you look at Thousand Plateaus, it does seem like he wants to collapse the distinction a little bit, or at least he's not as interested of keeping them separate. So I think that's a really interesting distinction, and it really, the way I would feel about it really changes based on whether I had just read Difference and Repetition or whether I just read Thousand Plateaus.
Yeah, and I think thank you for that. That's a very helpful way of sorting things out. I guess I think Serre thinks he's not doing history as you describe it, or as Deleuze's description would describe it. I do think that when he talks about circumstance, he is not simply talking about one discrete event leading to another. He wants to talk about the fact that our sensation has a foreground and a background, and that background, or that circumstance, or that surrounding torus is in some sense both given but also inaccessible to language, and that would be where I would distinguish it from a notion of history, for example. But yeah, this is still an open question in my mind. First of all, you know, I generally I don't like harmonizing moves in Deleuze. Like, okay, how does this concept in this book match up to this concept in this book? I think you're probably better off, at least as an initial gambit, of just taking each work on its own terms and figuring out how it works within those, and then asking, okay, well, is it like this other set of terms, or is it different from that other set of terms? But yeah, at the end of the day, I agree with your assessment that in Difference and Repetition, there is this explicit return to Kant, sort of mediated by Bergson and Jean Paul, probably, and that he's trying to engage with you know, the production of the actual in some sense. And that may be a different project from A Thousand Plateaus, for example.
Okay, I'm going to ask kind of a general question, maybe bring people in and on the Deleuze paper. So one thing I was not like completely clear on was how the Immanence of Pure Life essay plays into I don't know if you want to call it like a developmental sort of like reading of Deleuze, where he develops into this thinker who gets rid of the transcendental. So yeah, I guess what role does that play? Because I could also see someone saying, "Oh, that paper is maybe a problem for your thesis." It seems like you go either way. So yeah, maybe if you could just say some general words about that.
Yeah, no question. It's a contentious reading of the Eminence of Life, and it's a contentious reading of the Transcendental in Deleuze in general, right? I think I'm pretty clearly sort of going against the grain here in terms of what I think the Transcendental is doing in Deleuze, and ultimately how important I think it is in Deleuze, and whether a Deleuze without the Transcendental would be like a clean-shaven Marx, or something like that, right? A new image of Deleuze. So in terms of the Eminence essay, I mean, I talk about it because he returns to the transcendental field, right? And so there's a way in which there's a straight line drawn all the way through Deleuze's work, from Eminence of Life back to Logic of Sense, where he posits this, but also the use of the transcendental in Difference and Repetition, although I'm not committing to the claim that he's using transcendental in the same way in both difference in repetition and logic of sense. But prima facie, there is this continuity in terms of the use of transcendental across Deleuze's corpus. And so the way I read Immanence of Life here is that I read Deleuze as criticizing his own notion of the transcendental field, criticizing the way he's taken up the transcendental field in his earlier work. That the thing that he likes about it is that it is pre-personal and doesn't simply replicate empirical consciousness, but the thing that he avoids, at least in his use of it in logic of sense, is that it still remains eminent to consciousness. And so he's trying to eliminate that dative construction in the transcendental field. And so what he does on my reading is says, well, all I really mean by the transcendental field is a life, an immanent field that is eminent to nothing but itself, right? So typical descriptions of immanence from the later Deleuze, especially say, what is philosophy, for example. So yeah, that's my take, and that's why, you know, for example, he very famously uses the Dickens example of an unconscious person and the concern about the person who is not conscious as being this concern for a life and not any particular life. So yeah, I'll just stop there. But yeah, I think the equation of transcendental field to immanence is Deleuze having done with the transcendental.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it makes me wonder, it makes me want to almost wonder if maybe if there is a break from the more Kantian notion of transcendental, maybe it's not in A Thousand Plateaus, maybe it's in logic of sense, but that's something I have to think about more. So no one's raised their hand. I'm gonna, maybe people aren't aware, some people come into the room. So if you have a question, just go ahead and jump in. Next person can jump in. Or comment, doesn't have to be.
So I have a general question to just bring everyone in the discussion like the can you just summarize your argument in Deleuze paper just as you did in the like Serres paper for the Serres paper in the beginning, just to have it clear so that we have a clear view what you have of what you have in mind with your reading of the Transcendental in Deleuze.
You just did that.
Yeah, like okay, then
Hang on.
oh, someone
Good change.
just okay. Okay. Yeah, that's
I have a question that I wasn't planning on asking because I know this paper is controversial. So was this a conference paper, or I'm just sort of curious what the response was?
I gave it at SPEP.
Okay.
Yeah, I got some pushback on it. There was a surprisingly, to me, spirited defense of the transcendental, and a worry that something will be lost if we get rid of the transcendental in Deleuze. And I guess I grant that, yes, that something would be lost. My question is, well, would it be a bad thing if we lost that in Deleuze? And I guess I want to pose it as an experiment, right? Well, let's follow that. Let's see where it goes and see what kind of philosophy we end up with. And maybe at the end of the day, it's not tenable. It doesn't allow the creation of new concepts. Or alternately, maybe this concern about the transcendental, this anchoring in the virtual might be a blockage, might be a place where thought is territorialized on itself and has all these protective mechanisms around it. And so, yeah, you would rightly ask the question, well, we wouldn't even be doing philosophy anymore if we got rid of the transcendental. And I'm okay with pursuing it that far.
James?
Yeah, so my question about your worry about the dative construction of the transcendental, and I assume you see some of that haunting his use of the transcendental in difference, repetition, and logic of sense. An example of that is that when he talks about being on the transcendental field or moving about on the surface, is that sort of what you mean by like the dative construction?
Yeah, that everything would become related to the field as a kind of ground.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and then
Okay, so like the idea of it as like a surface is sort of part of your worry.
right, that is a common way of taking up the transcendental.
Mm-hmm.
Not that I would necessarily accuse Deleuze of doing that, but it
Mm-hmm.
it haunts the conception.
Okay, yeah.
All right, Dan's next.
Yeah, sorry if no one else says anything. I'll keep taking advantage of Brent's presence. Yeah, so I'm sympathetic, like getting rid of the transcendental. There's always also the fact that last essay, Immanence of Life, begins with the question, what's a transcendental field? So, whatever, Deleuze doesn't quite get rid of it, but of course it's already different then. So sort of related to what I asked earlier is how you see that, and it's almost if how we can seize of his transcendental field or plane of immanence or whatever term one gives to it changes. And one example, I'm just curious about this example and how you see that kind of evolution in Deleuze's work as a whole, because you emphasize the immanence of life, the Dickens thing, which is indeed quite provocative. But I was asked to write a thing on Spinoza's notion of effect recently, so I was looking at Spinoza and what Deleuze does with the notion of effect. And even though Spinoza is, for Deleuze, the great philosopher of immanence, clearly because God is made immanent to nature, on the other hand, when Deleuze distinguishes between the plane of consistency and the plane of organization, consistency being immanent, organization being transcendent, it seemed to me to imply a kind of critique of Spinoza as not being immanent enough. Because, for instance, when he talks about affects, the examples in Spinoza are very human affects. I eat food, I experience an affect of joy. I have poison, I experience an affect of sadness because in one case I compose a relation with the food. In the other case, it decomposes my relation. But those affects and those relations are already immanent to an already existing mode. And so in Spinoza, he makes this first move toward immanence, but it's not immanent enough for Deleuze, and or at least this is my question, because when he gets to the plane of consistency, it's just pure affects, quite apart from being the affect of any given mode, and pure relations, quite apart from the fact of whether it's my relation that's being composed or decomposed. So it's almost as if already in A Thousand Plateaus, when he starts going back to Spinoza, it's like, yeah, Spinoza's my hero, and he's an immanent philosopher, but I'm just going to push him one step further. I don't even want these affects or relations to be immanent to a mode. I just want to consider them in and of themselves. And when I get there, that's a kind of pure immanence. Maybe that's a transcendental field, but of course, then using that term in a sort of uniquely Deleuzian way that really has nothing to do with anyone else. So that's kind of two questions there. Still back to my first two, like, does it really matter, the term transcendental? But also for me, the more interesting question, is there a history of what that immanent field is? I just feel like Deleuze is constantly tracking it and pushing it, as far as he can go, even in that maybe last essay that you focused on the Dickens example of a life.
Yeah, I, like you, always return to Spinoza whenever I have a problem in Deleuze, I go to Spinoza to try and, think through it. Okay, well, how would this work in Spinoza? And is Deleuze saying something like this or not? And so, as you know, he loves Spinoza because Spinoza is the only philosopher to hunt down transcendence wherever he found it. But there's also a transformation of Spinoza happening in relation to Deleuze. And one way that I think about it is it's the Nietzschean inversion of Spinoza, right? So it's the way in which Deleuze plays Nietzsche and Spinoza off one another. And the way I think about that is in Nietzsche, you have a Spinoza without substance, which might just be another way of saying in Nietzsche, you have Lucretius instead of Spinoza, where you simply have interactions, and that any kind of organization is always this second order effect over and above these interactions. And I think, yeah, that's where Deleuze is trying to get. And I think he's caught in this paradox. And it's the same paradox that Spinoza runs into, that Lucretius runs into, that Nietzsche runs into, which is really Kant's problem, that thought seeks the unconditioned. So sure, you have these pure relations, and you think of any kind of identity as a function of or arising out of those relations and not distinct from them. You would think of them as a transcendental field or circumstance, or any of the words that we've been using here today. But at the same time, it's hard, maybe nigh impossible, if Kant is right, not to think about them, all of these interactions in their totality, the universe in which these interactions happen. And so I think Deleuze goes back and forth between these two, right? So on the one hand, there is this sort of elimination of substance in Spinoza, but also at the same time, the ethics is the great, book of the body without organs, right? That all of the substance and attributes are all bodies without organs within bodies without organs. So, having said all of that, I think this difficulty, this paradox, is manifested in readings of Spinoza, or possible readings of Spinoza. And this is the problem that Schelling dealt with, for example. How do we take the relation between substance and modes? What exactly is the nature of that relation? Is substance over and above the modes and simply contains them? Or is substance nothing other than the aggregate of modes and just a linguistic necessity to be able to talk about the totality, for example? Or another way, is the difference between natura naturans and natura naturata an ontological distinction? Did they name two distinct things? Or is it an epistemological distinction? That is, are they two ways of thinking about this process, either from the perspective of the whole, a high altitude view, or from the perspective of modes from within? And so I think, like you, I see Deleuze leaning heavily on the epistemological reading of that distinction and trying to eliminate the ontological reading wherever he finds it, even in Spinoza. So that was probably too convoluted to be useful as an answer, but maybe just by way of summary, I would say yes. The way we think about the relation between consistency and organization is we think about consistency as this pre-personal field, but a field that is nothing other than the sum of its affects. And that the problem to be solved, or the question to be asked, is thinking about organization as arising out of this field or circumstance or intensity or the virtual or whichever word you want to insert there. But yeah, I have no idea. I felt like I talked way too long about that, if that was at all useful.
That was great. Can I just quickly follow up then? Because you're saying naturata and naturans, you say he kind of has an epistemological read, which almost sounds like you're back to that other question of does, if he gets rid of the transcendental, does Deleuze also get rid of ontology? Is that not a question he really poses, at least in the same way? Is that where you're, seems like heading that way when you said really that's an epistemological, not an ontological distinction?
Well, yeah, I mean, I do think that if Deleuze has an ontology, he has an ontology of degrees, not an ontology of kinds. But without an ontology of kinds, it's not clear that you have an ontology at all, because you're not naming different kinds of beings. You're simply saying that there is only a univocal being, and the differences we see are differences that are eternal and arise as a result of processes or making and breaking of connections.
All right, thanks.
I have another question, since we're getting such a pleasure to ask extra questions. Normally we just get the one in, but one thing I'm curious is that in the Deleuze paper, it's sort of haunted by 1,000 plateaus, at least how you're reading it, where it's like these two things just don't seem to fit together. And so you said, and you've touched on this already, but that intensity can play that role.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other concepts in 1,000 plateaus which sort of, I'm trying to think of things like abstract machines. I don't know that work as well. So is there sort of this, I don't know, I guess I'm trying to think, because there are certain things the virtual or the transcendental is doing. And it's one thing to say, well, intensity can play that role, but it seems like there's all this conceptual sort of machinery in 1,000 plateaus. So I guess I'm asking you a very general question of like, which concepts in that book are, I mean, maybe all of them in a way, are playing that role or explaining how we don't need a transcendental.
Yeah, I think that 1,000 plateaus is not composed of a sequence of concepts that build on one another. I think that each plateau in 1,000 plateaus is trying to connect philosophy to its outside. And so this is going to happen in different fields depending on which plateau or which question they're interested in, right? So sometimes it's anthropology, sometimes it's literature, sometimes it's music. But what might we say is going on in every case? And once I pose it that way, I see I posed the question wrongheadedly, as if there were some general thing going on in each case. I think each plateau is a particular intervention and a singular intervention, and there isn't a general theory being proposed in 1,000 plateaus. So, as a very long windup to your straightforward question, I would say that you could deploy almost any of the concepts from any of the plateaus to show that they're trying to play this circumstantial role or this intensive role. And it gets named different ways depending on the particular kind of intervention, right? So sure, intensity, smooth space, what else? War machine. All of these name intensities that surround and imbue and transversally cross, you know, extensities or the state or striated space. And the question is always, what sort of transformations does that make possible, or how can we think about those kinds of transformations?
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Yeah, because it seems like polarization is important in a lot of these concepts, which can't think of indifference or repetition if that's like a real theme. So that I'm just thinking out loud. So anyone else can jump in here.
I have a question. So, so regarding the main argument of the paper, like intensity can do the job that transcendental does in the early Deleuze. So I agree that like in later Deleuze, we don't have this concept of the transcendental, and maybe he just thinks that he doesn't need it because intensity or the other concepts does a better job or the same job. I don't know. But in the context of difference and repetition, I was thinking, so what is the problem that the concept transcendental answers to for Deleuze? And the question I have, like the problem is, I think, is the problem of this Kantian problem of the given. Like Kant asks how the given is possible, but Deleuze thinks that like the question we should ask is like, what is the thing through which or by which the given is given? And he says it is difference. So then this transcendental maps into pure differences, and which is, I think, as like connected to time, pure form of time, whatever. But when I think intensity, like I am not sure if we can say that just replace the word intensity with difference in this context, in this very context that transcendental for Deleuze, like he's concerned with the problem of transcendental. What I mean is like we cannot say experience, like the given or the intensity is by which the given is given, or can we? Like this is a question. Like what about the given, the question or problem of given or the conditions of real experience and intensity? How do you think that's relationship?
I think that's a great way of posing the question. And my initial question back to you is, well, depends on what you mean by the given. If by the given you mean something like extensities, discrete, individuated, measurable objects of experience, then I think, yes, very straightforwardly, intensity is that which the given, by which the given is given. If, however, you want to articulate that no, the given actually precedes extensities, for example, and this would be Serres' argument, then you wouldn't say that intensity is that by which the given is given. You would say intensity just is the given, or intensity is that which is given.
Yeah, and yeah, I think, I don't know, it's just an interpretation because that part of the text, like difference and repetition, is very complex, where he talks about intensity and the relationship between intensity and virtual, like we were just discussing it yesterday. But just I feel like for Deleuze, what is given maps onto intensity, like what is like the experience you experience an intensity. That's why maybe the title of the chapter 5 of difference and repetition is asymmetrical senses of the sensible. So what you have insensible is intensity. But what is the condition, like transcendent, like, yeah, here we have, what's the transcendental condition of intensity? And it is pure differences. I think it is time. So this is why, like, this is my reading, but I generally think Deleuze as just like, what he does with the transcendental, I think, is just to reverse this Kantian notions of time and space. I think he just gives a new status to time and space. Like the new time is not the inner intuition, like like the inner form of the intuition, but it is the pure form of time which conditions any event, and intensities in it. Intensities kind of blossom and like just bursts out every time. But for the space, he understands space intensively, like rather than extensively. So in a way, he reverses all these two. So this is, I don't know if you would agree, but this is my thing anyway. It's not a like an immediately visible thing in Deleuze, but I think the intensity is kind of the space part of the transcendental project he has in mind, like the condition of extensive spatial relations, or I don't know, space is intensity, and yeah, we have pure form of time on the other side, whatever. Like, yeah. Would you agree with that, or does it like sound to you? I don't know. How does it sound to you? Like,
So I like this reading of difference and repetition. I'll defer to others, on whether there might be issues here. But here's my concern. Like, supposing this is right, it just looks like we get caught up in an infinite regress with regard to the transcendental in that case, right? If I want to say that, okay, well, the conditions by which the given is given are, the pure form of time, or the three syntheses of time. Why wouldn't I ask, well, what are the conditions for those to be given? Why wouldn't that just lead to an infinite regress? And then it looks like we're in some sort of, emanative model where transcendental conditions surround transcendental conditions surround transcendental conditions. And so maybe this is naive of me, but it looks like we could avoid that problem if we just simply said, given intensity is the given, and intensity is the transcendental in that case. And whatever we experience, whether it be discrete objects or intensities, arise out of these intensities interacting with one another. And of course, that could be very complex and nonlinear and enter into all sorts of complexity theory kind of illustrations, right? This isn't some kind of simple relation for Deleuze, right? It differs in itself. But, I think that is, for me, and I hadn't thought about it this way, but that is for me a concern that I would have about the transcendental, that as much as you try to guard against being immanent to something, the very structure of positing a transcendental, some pure a priori form, runs you into a problem of infinite regress.
Do you want to follow up, Amit? Oh,
but I need to think about it. That's a like I need to digest this line of thought. Maybe I can come back after. Yeah.
oh, go ahead, James.
So I think the infinite regress worry with transcendental conditions of experience is a really valid one. And so I'm thinking about like how to defend Deleuze from this, and I think it might be something like, well, at least I gave some real transcendental conditions, and most of the history of philosophy simply just traced the transcendental from the empirical and didn't really explore the transcendental at all. And so for me to have at least explored it legitimately to some degree, even if there are regress problems, at least I've made like this amazing, Copernican, like second Copernican revolution in philosophy or something where,
Sure.
Yeah. But I think I like your infinite regress worry, and I think it's something to think about more. But also the idea of intensity being given. I think that's a really good way of understanding perhaps how he changes from difference in repetition to thousand plateaus, because the difference in repetition, I think his notion of the given is simply what's given are empirical objects. Like here's a laptop, here's a phone, and then things that aren't strictly actual represented objects are then not given, but like he'll say intensity is always implicated. So he has words like implicated, and then virtual ideas are perplicated within one another. And so he has this very difficult logic of expression and how things that aren't strictly empirical objects are not given, but are expressed in the given and exist in this mode of being expressed. And I think maybe in Thousand Plateaus, he relaxes that a bit and is more comfortably speaking of continuous multiplicities or virtual multiplicities as in somehow being immediately given. And of course, the difference between like a discrete and a continuous multiplicity is not like one thing over here, one thing over there, but a discrete multiplicity is just a continuous multiplicity where there's some sort of transcendence that is allowing there to be a discrete, we call it discretization of it, right? Like in anti-Oedipus, with the Oedipus triangle, you're able to turn desiring production into desiring production that always goes between the poles of daddy, mommy, me, etc. Anyway, so yeah, this is really interesting. I've been enjoying this talk so far. So yeah.
Yeah, great. That's sort of very super helpful summary of my grasping as we go along here. And yeah, I think that's exactly right. That's after difference in repetition, the problem becomes not so much how is the given, but how is the given, which is intensity, how does that get captured in extensities, and what sorts of blockages, what sorts of transcendences are imposed as a result of this, and that the process of creation always requires, not only understanding the process, that led to this discretization, but also where the deterritorializing edges are, because that's where creation is going to happen.
You want to follow up, James, or?
No, well, I think that's I think a perfect way of understanding like the shift in Deleuze is that political shift where instead of trying to get from the actual to the virtual, he's trying to understand how the virtual within history, within how desire and production becomes social production, how the free syntheses become coded into exclusive disjunction. So I think that's a really really interesting way of sort of grasping the post logic of sense sort of turn. Yeah.
So I'm going to pause if anyone wants to jump in on this particular discussion, because I'm about to change gears with my next question back to Serres. So I'll give anyone if they want to chime in.
Like I have a question, but it's not fully formulated, so I'm not sure if I should talk right now and mess up, or maybe I should wait you and maybe then
Sure.
if I
No.
formulate it.
No, the gradual production of thoughts while talking.
Yeah, okay.
Nice.
Okay, yeah. I think I follow up I followed like your line of thinking, and that's great. So I was thinking about it and thinking about this problem of infinite regress, then I am not sure, because like what is the transcendental condition that Deleuze gives us as a condition of any event? So I think it is like the pure form of time as like synonym of pure differences is the transcendental condition. So, but this condition itself, to me, designates something very similar to what you describe in Serres paper. Like this transcendental condition, like the pure form of time or pure differences, are not like general conditions, but singular at each moment. Because what happens is like time generate, like at each moment, something new, something purely different is generated. It's not like time is the like the framework, like stable condition of any event, but it is kind of, as he puts it, pure and empty form. It is not like stable, but just a form in which new novelties emerge. Sorry, just so given that, I am not sure if this transcendental condition leaves us with the problem of infinite regress, if I understand your concern correctly. And then, yeah, this is the first thing. Maybe I should stop here. Maybe I don't understand your
No,
concern.
I think that's a great response, and I think that's exactly how Deleuze would respond, or at least the Deleuze of difference and repetition would respond. No, I've discovered, I've invented this purely formal concept, and this purely formal concept is, I don't know, what would we say? A necessary structure of thought, something that cannot be thought beyond or as contained within anything else. And here, I think I would press you and say, okay, it's a pure form of thought, but it's not general, it's singular. That I'm not so sure about. I have difficulty, and it may just be my difficulty, imagining, okay, how is pure form not anything other than a synonym for generality?
I think that that's a very valid question, and this, let me just say how I solve the problem in my mind. So the thing is, I think it is about how he understands time. So the time, I think he follows this Bergsonian conic understanding of time rather than like linear understanding of time. We have this conic cone of time in which we have the present, and within it contained all the past. And what comes next, the future, is not like a linear succession of the present, but just something created, like something novel that is, I don't know, added to it, in quotes. So then what we have, so when we think time in this regard, so what comes next can completely destroy everything in this, what is contained in this cone of time, present and past. And this includes the whole of time itself, I think, which means like pure form of time, like a future, in a future moment, everything may disappear, which means this condition itself, even the condition as a pure form of time, has a precarious metaphysical status. It is not general. It is not valid for all times and for all places. Because when you say it is valid for all times, you already suppose this generality and linearity of time. But in the Deleuzean picture, it cannot be valid for all times, because in a future moment, time may disappear, basically. So it is a condition, it's a kind of transient condition or a precarious condition of all the events. This is how I solve the problem, like rather than, because otherwise you say, as you say, it is like a universal condition, and Deleuze becomes a Kant, like becomes Kant, whatever. So, but what makes Deleuze unique, I think, and I think very close to Serres. I think I really like the Serres paper because I think I agree with what James said about like the actual what he said, whatever. But the idea of singular conditioning, let's call it singular conditioning rather than universal conditioning, is what Deleuze have in mind, because he says we will not ask what it is, what an entity is, but how much, where it is, blah blah blah, all these singular questions, because what matter is the moment of this singular eruption. So whatever, this is my way of going with it. I don't know, I talked too much, sorry.
Yeah, no, I think this is the answer. I think if one wanted to save the transcendental in Deleuze, this would be the way to do it. And I have no objections to that, right? You know, my question is, well, must we use that, or is there another way to do philosophy without that? Is that thinkable? Because at the end of the day, while I would affirm your reading of the pure form of time as accurate and as saving move for Deleuze, you know, supposing that this is a valid criticism, I still, and maybe this is just a personal problem or a problem of language, it's still the pure form of time, right? How can that not be general? Like I can't, yeah, it may just be my problem, but pure form just sounds like generality. I don't know how to separate those. And so, you know, either you're saying, oh, well, pure form doesn't mean pure form because it changes every time, in which case it's not pure form, or pure form, pure form doesn't mean pure form.
Like pure form does not change, but it is precarious. Like it is existence. It is existence as a condition is precarious. It is not universal. It can destruct itself. Like it is.
But,
yeah. What
but does it really
mean?
destroy itself? It keeps reasserting itself as a pure form.
Yeah, that's
So
a pro.
if I could jump in here for a second.
Yeah.
So the pure and empty form of time, I do agree that it's a universal condition. But the bizarre, almost paradoxical thing, it's the universal condition that everything must be singular. And so it's a universal condition that does nothing but produce uniqueness and singularity. And so it has a paradoxical character where its own universality almost like puts itself under eraser, because you simply have newness instead of sort of identity throughout, you know, experience as a result of an identical, you could say like a quasi-identical, you know, condition. So I think you're both right somehow at the same time because of the paradoxical character of it.
I think we're really running up against sort of the limits of metaphysics, right? That, you know, these are the exact kind of paradoxes and antinomies that one discovers at the limits of reason, right? We're still sort of working in this Kantian paradigm. And so, yeah, and we could say, you know, like any antinomy, we could solve it mathematically and say they're both false, or we could solve it dynamically and say they're both true, or, you know, we could have some other kind of solution to the antinomy. And yeah, and maybe sort of in those terms, my solution is let's do something else. Well, let's try this thing over here. But, you know, no shade on anyone who wants to sort of continue working in a project. I'm just sort of thinking out loud. I do have another article called How Not to Think About Time, where I do talk about some of these issues in Deleuze. I'm pretty sure it's on my academia page. If you wanted to look at that, maybe it'd be helpful, maybe it wouldn't.
I will surely check it. I didn't know that. Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Micah has been waiting patiently. You're up.
Hi, it's actually Micah and Faye, and I wanted to ask a question, but it is on the concept of time that we have been discussing and the infinite regression problem. So are you sure I should go ahead? It's like a follow-up to Ahmed's question and the answer. So I was thinking that the infinite regression argument is very interesting because I thought, okay, conditions, and then we would either go towards that danger that you mentioned, or we would have to find something unconditioned. And so again, we would have this problem. But since the pure form of time came up, and I was thinking that isn't it Deleuze's solutions towards the unconditioned to put eternal return as the unconditioned that is singular and also self-destroying, so it's not universal. So forgive me if I'm just like bringing up a standard reading, but I just wanted to make sure that this is the standard way to deal with the problem of the unconditioned, right?
Yeah, right. The solution is to propose a fundamental difference, right? That which returns is always the active, that there is no first term, that we're always in the middle somewhere. That's the way I understand it.
I'm just saying because when we, I don't know how to put that, when we just say form without this internal thing going on, it does sound weird and it does sound a generality, but with this clarification it changes. And I merely wanted to mention it because I hear Ahmed's intervention. I was just wondering why Bergson was the answer to that and wouldn't be eternal return. But
no, I mean, Deleuze is explicit, right, that the eternal return is the model for the third synthesis. But this is after lots of Bergson has been sort of shoveled onto the pile before he gets to that point. And I think, I mean, I wonder, I don't know, if my question would still remain. Isn't the eternal return nothing other than the empty form of time? Don't we just sort of reproduce the question, but reproduce it in terms of the eternal return?
I will hold on to that question because I am working on that. But I was thinking that it's not that we never see eternal return from the point of view of form, but we see form from the point of view of the return. It is the return that changes the concept of form, not the form that changes the concept of the return. Yet this might be arbitrary on my part, so I will think about that. But thank you for this wonderful discussion. I was very excited.
My pleasure. Yeah, I'm getting tons of ideas too. That's why we talk. I probably shouldn't say this, but the problem of infinite regress like occurred in real time as we were talking. So yeah, thanks. I'm gonna keep working on that.
Okay, we're coming up to time. We'll see how many more questions we can get. I'm going to, I think it's actually a good time to bring it back to Serres. And I want to bring it back to the example of the dinner party. So, early it's been kind of argued here, I think by Ahmed and James, that those are actual entities and actual entities. But I was wondering if what Serres is actually talking about is maybe better formulated to like the notion of like a problematic field versus what becomes actual for the particular person. But then it sounds kind of phenomenological. So I guess maybe I'm wondering what is a good way to think. Are we maybe not thinking of that example intensively enough? Are we thinking of it too extensively? It's kind of a general question.
Yeah, so I think intensively is always the way to go, whether it's Deleuze or Serres. though Serres does not use, at least in my recollection, use the word intensive as much or as an object of analysis the way that Deleuze does. But you know, for him, something like information theory is more important. So he's interested in noise or chaos, to put a mythological spin on it, as that which out of anything extensive or experiential might arise, but that the sort of relation of noise to signal is reversible, and one can become the other. And here I think Serres would, among other things, refer to Leibniz and this notion of, well, we can hear the waves if we're near a beach, but we don't single out each particular wave. Like there is this background of noise, of chaos, and it's only when we're forced to, or our attention is directed in a particular way, not to make this fully phenomenological, but just as an example, that noise coalesces into discrete objects. And the problem of philosophy, of Western philosophy, or the confusion, is that it's swapped the order of these two things and imagines that these discrete things are primary, and so what needs to be accounted for is change or chaos. And Serres is saying, well, no, as Hesiod, chaos comes first. And so the problem we need to figure out is why do stabilities arise at all, and what is the nature of their stability? Is it essential, or is it something like a metastability in thermodynamics?
Yeah, no, thank you. Also, you can't help but think of nonsense and sense and logic of sense. Like that ability for, which sense gets affirmed is not, guaranteed, and it can switch.
Right.
So I'm going to leave it open for one last quick question, if anyone has one. Otherwise, we'll wrap up here. All right. Well, I think we all need to thank Dr. Adkins for what's been a really great talk. A lot to think about. And someone's entering the waiting room as we're leaving. So yeah, thank you. I'm going to do a quick announcement for what we have coming up. We have 2 more meetings for this Purdue semester. One, the date and time has not been announced yet, but it's going to be George Webster. Actually, I don't know. What's George's background? It's in the UK?
I think he finished his PhD at University of Oxford, and he is kind of in job market right now. He is a junior scholar. I think he might just got a job from University of Lancaster or somewhere. I don't remember exactly, but yeah, he's a junior scholar who got their PhD at University of Oxford, and we will be discussing his article titled "The Metaphysics Science Needs, Deleuze's Naturalism," which is published in European Journal of Philosophy just a few months ago.
Yep. And then after that, we have Michael Arbeline to talk on his work on Deleuze, mathematics, and metaphysics, and that'll be April 26th, which is a Friday, 2:30 p.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So yeah, that's what we have to look forward. Thank you everyone for coming out. I don't think I have anything else to announce.
Thank you, Brent, for great discussion and just being here. I really enjoyed the whole discussion, and thank you for accepting our invitation.
It was absolutely my pleasure. Thanks for having me. It was a great time. Best of luck on your future work. And yeah, if you have other things you want to talk about, feel free to reach out to me.
Thank you. Yeah, sure.
Will do. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.